Bruce is the chairman of the board of the National Disability Insurance Agency, and I think it's fair to say he has been one of the drivers of the establishment of the NDIS through all the political ups and downs of the last 5 or 6 years that we've had. So we do acknowledge your courage and perseverance in this regard. It's a great achievement for you and other leaders who've continued through. He was formerly the President of Philanthropy Australia, also formerly the convener of the independent panel appointed to advise the Productivity Commission and government during the inquiry into long-term care and support for Australians with a disability. He's also held a number of senior positions in the funds management industry and insurance industry in Australia and internationally. He's the father of 3 adult sons, 2 of whom have disabilities, and Bruce was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia in 2010 for services to people with disabilities, their families and carers, and to the community. So thank you very much. Please give a warm welcome to Bruce.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all for coming. It's terrific to see so many people here and for me to have the opportunity to talk to you. I get great energy, I think, out of talking to people with disabilities and their families and carers, because you are the people at the heart of the NDIS, and I think it's very important to always remain very grounded when involved in a big government scheme. It's too easy, I think, to lose sight of the people who are at its heart, and hence my desire to come out and talk today and more generally meet with people with disability and their families and carers whenever I can. What I'd like to do today is to start by talking to you a little bit about how the NDIS is different, how it differs from the system that you've all grown up with and got used to, and how it improves on what has come before it. I'd then like to give you a bit of an update as to where we are in terms of rolling out the scheme, what we've learnt to date, and then talk about who's likely to be eligible for the scheme, the sorts of benefits that people receive if they become participants in the scheme, and then what you might do in order to get ready, because the scheme will start to roll out nationally from the middle of next year. And so to the extent that planning is an important part of the scheme, there is an opportunity to plan between now and then. So when I think about the NDIS, I think the first thing that's different about it is that it is the support people receive is based on need. Until the introduction of the NDIS, the support people received really depended on where they lived, what the name of their disability is. So some children got access to helping children with autism packages, but if you had a child with spina bifida, you got nothing. It also depended on how you acquired your disability. So for people whose permanent and significant disabilities arose as a result of a workplace accident, and in some cases a motor vehicle accident, there was insurance for that. But if you were born with a disability, there was no insurance. So the first thing about this scheme is that support is based on need and it's equitable. The second thing is that, as well as being based on need, there is a provision for early intervention, and I'll come to that a little later on. My own interest in the potential for an NDIS actually arose out of an experience when I was chairman of Uralla, which is Victoria's largest disability service provider. And I went to one of our services and sat down with a mum and talked to her about the needs of her child. And she said to me, "Why can't I get the early intervention services I need?" And my response was, well, look, we're doing everything we can. But when I reflected on that a moment later, after I'd said it, as I reflected on what I'd said, I thought how appalling my answer was, because there was me with my connections, with the education I've been fortunate to receive, and there was this woman who was clearly newly arrived in Australia, had no connections, no money, and I was doing nothing to help her. And really it was from that moment on that I decided that I wanted to make a difference to not the people that Urella was serving, but all those people that Urella was not serving. And so equity and fairness lies at the heart of the NDIS. As you know, for many years, support in Queensland has been lower if you're a person with a disability than if you've lived in New South Wales or Victoria. And so the second thing about this scheme is that it's national. So the support you receive is no longer subject to that postcode lottery that has been the case until now. The third important thing about this scheme is that historically, governments have given their funding direct to service providers and what's called block purchased services from them, and then expected people with disabilities and their families to go to those service providers and take those particular services that are on offer. Under the NDIS, the funding will go to the individual, and if the individual cannot manage the funding, will go to their families or carer. And you're going to be free to choose the services that best meet your needs. So the control shifts from government and service providers to the individual, and you'll be able to shop for your best disability services that best meet your needs in a new marketplace that we think will emerge over the next few years. Obviously for service providers, and Paul was alluding to that, this is a dramatic change in their business model involving a complete turnaround from principally having government as customers to having individuals as customers. And so there's an enormous amount of change and complexity for service providers. And as an agency, we're trying to work with those service providers to assist them in this change. But the important thing is that the power will shift to individuals and their families. The fourth important point about this scheme is that we want it delivered in communities. We want to operate as a very decentralised organisation and very connected to local communities, because those local communities are what make people with disabilities, in fact all of us, feel included. And so working with mainstream providers, working with the local community is very important. And as an agency, we're going to employ a group of people called local area coordinators who will work with participants to help them be part of local communities. And the final point I just want to make about the scheme is that it's an insurance scheme, and people often don't understand what we mean by that. So let me just spend a moment on that. If you think about the old system of supporting people with disabilities, it was subject to cuts in government funding on an annual basis. And governments primarily sought to keep the costs of disability services at an absolute minimum on an annual basis. What that led to was a lot of very short-term decision-making. And in the long run, it was decision-making that was counterproductive, because more and more of the funding in the old system was consumed in supporting people in emergencies and in crisis, rather than investing in them to build their independence so that in the long term they've maximised their independence, maximised their opportunity, and as a result cost governments less to support. So one of the things that the NDIS will do is invest in people through early intervention, through providing them with essential equipment, and with that we're looking to build the independence of people to the maximum extent, to have them engaged in community and in work where that's possible. And ultimately we believe that that will reduce the long-term costs. And in aligning the interests of the scheme with participants in this way, we believe that it's in everyone's best interest. So let me now give you a snapshot of where we're up to. We've been operating the scheme since the 1st of July 2013. We started in 4 trial sites. in the Barwon region of Victoria around Geelong, in the Hunter region of New South Wales around Newcastle. And in both of those cases, these were trials that brought every person with a significant and permanent disability into the scheme. So they were what we call whole of population trials. In South Australia, it was 0 to 14-year-olds who were due to come into the scheme, and in Tasmania, 15 to 24-year-olds. So in both those cases, they were age cohorts that came into the scheme. On the 1st of July 2014, we began in the ACT, and over the last 12 months and the next 12 months, we will bring every person with a disability into the scheme in the ACT. We also began in the Perth Hills area of Western Australia, and also in the Barkly Tablelands of the Northern Territory. The Barkly Tablelands trial site is particularly important because it gives us an opportunity to trial the scheme in a remote community. In fact, the Barkly Shire is one of the most remote areas of Australia. If you don't know it, it's centred on Tennant Creek. There are just 8,000 people who live in the Barkly. The Barkly is 329,000 square kilometres. It's the size of Poland. Poland's got 39 million people and we've got 8,000, of which, as I said, 3.5 are in Tennant Creek and the other 4,500 are dotted through remote communities in that region. And as you can imagine, the principal challenge in that community is building trust with people, because they've seen many government programs come and go, and then how we build the supply side, the services, to meet the needs of those people. But I'm pleased to say it's going very well. We've got 100 participants already in the scheme in the Barkly, and we've seen a very pleasing amount of development of new service providers there. We, just at the beginning of this financial year, we began the transition to full scheme in Nepean Blue Mountains region in Western Sydney, and that's now underway. And a month or so ago, we announced with the Queensland Government the start of the launch of the scheme in Queensland, which will be in Townsville, Palm Island and Charters Towers. And we see that experience in Townsville is extremely important. One of the things we knew before we started the scheme was that each state and territory had developed their existing disability systems quite differently. And so in trying to create a national scheme, in each jurisdiction we're starting from slightly different spots. There are different strengths and different weaknesses. And so obviously the weaknesses we need to overcome and the strengths we need to build on. And what we'll be able to learn in Townsville and Charters Towers and Palm Island is how to roll out the scheme centred on a major regional centre on the coast, and then take that both west and, in that case, east onto Palm Island. And so develop a hub and spoke model that we think will be particularly important here in Queensland. We expect that by the time we reach full scheme, there will be 460,000 participants in the scheme around Australia, and about just under 100,000 of those will be in Queensland. The trial or the launch in North Queensland will focus on 0 to 17-year-olds in Townsville and Charters Towers, and it'll be all people on Palm Island. And we expect there to be about 600 plans by July of next year. So quite small, but from there we'll grow the scheme across Queensland. With a view to being fully implemented by the middle of 2019. Just how that's going to occur is not yet clear, because the important agreement that needs to be signed between the Commonwealth and Queensland governments has not yet been signed. That's known as a bilateral agreement. Those bilateral agreements have been signed for New South Wales and for Victoria, but not yet for other states and territories. But I know that the Commonwealth and the other governments are all working very hard to get those completed as soon as possible. One thing to note about the scheme is that the rollout is so large that you cannot do it all in one day. And so, as you will have seen from, or may have seen from the agreements that have been signed between the Commonwealth and New South Wales and with Victoria, there's a progressive rollout schedule which goes across different geographies. We don't have anything to do with that. That's something that the governments will negotiate. So I just really make that point because not everyone can be first. And there will be a sequential rollout that will take the full 3 years. What I say to people is two things. The first thing is that we need to do this right. And what's really important is that the scheme is there not just for current generations, but for future generations. And the second point I make is that there is no fair way of making an unfair system fair. And that's just the sad reality of it. We understand that there are people who are waiting desperately for the scheme, but there is no way we can do it all in a day. And so I will ask you for your forbearance in terms of when it might come to you. So let me now turn to the scheme itself, let me start with the eligibility criteria. So the people who are eligible for this scheme, they can come in under two broad categories. The first is for people who have a significant and permanent disability. So the scheme is not designed to support people who have a temporary disability as a result of a recent hospitalisation. It's there for people who have permanent, ongoing disability and where the impact in terms of their function is significant. There's more detail on this on our website. And the person therefore needs, not only does it need to be a significant disability, but there needs to be a need for ongoing supports. The person needs to be aged under 65 when the scheme starts, and they need to be an Australian resident or Australian citizen or hold a permanent visa or protected special category visa. The area where this is important is for those people who are New Zealanders who are living here and may not have that sort of, may not be a resident or have taken out Australian citizenship. That's been the main issue that's arisen. In terms of determining eligibility for the scheme, we are working hard with state governments so that we can actually pre-qualify people for the scheme. And the way we're doing that is that we're looking at the eligibility requirements for existing state government programs, and where they match the eligibility for the NDIS very closely, people will automatically qualify for the NDIS. Where they're not where they're not receiving any support at the moment, or they're only receiving support through programs where the eligibility is not aligned to our eligibility criteria, there will be a need to go through an eligibility assessment. And that assessment will focus primarily on functional impairment rather than medical diagnosis. You may be asked for what the medical diagnosis is, but that's not the primary basis on which entry to the scheme is undertaken. We're interested in medical diagnosis partly because of the prognosis it will give us about future needs rather than for the diagnosis itself. The second criteria under which people can come into the scheme is early intervention. So this could be a child who has got a manifest disability from birth, or it could be a child that is experiencing significant developmental delay. So there are essentially two criteria under which people can come in under the early intervention classification as a child. And then we also include under the early intervention category progressive neurological conditions like motor neurone disease or motor neurone disease that occurs later in life but before the age of 65. Once eligible for the scheme, each person will get an individual plan and individual budget. The plan is designed to look at not just the formal funding that you'll need from us, but also look at the family and friendship supports that people have and how they can be supported in the community. And the reason that we look at this, the supports more broadly than just what we as an agency can provide, is because a quality life depends on loving relationships, friendships, as well as government support. A quality life is not built just on paid government-funded support. And then what we look at is what we will look at is providing benefits which are termed in the Act reasonable and necessary. We think about the supports people receive in three categories. The first is what we would call capital items. So would you need a new wheelchair or a talking device or another piece of essential equipment? Where people receive funding for equipment, it needs to be spent on that equipment. We then fund what we call capacity building. So this is which could be an early intervention would fall into that category. So this is where we're providing supports that build the capacity of the individual to be more independent and to be more included in community and in work. And the third category of supports is what we call core or consumption type supports. So this is personal care and access to the community and so forth. In assessing what is reasonable, we look at evidence for therapy services as to the benefit that occurs from them and value for money. And as part of what we're doing at the moment is we're building up a quite large database which is going to inform what we regard as reasonable and necessary. We embed this in a framework which looks at outcomes. So we're interested in improving outcomes for participants in terms of building their independence, ensuring they have access to education, ensuring that they are supported in their relationships and a part of community and work where possible. And the other part of it is that we look at outcomes for families. So do families feel well supported in their caring roles? Do they have a succession plan? Are they able to advocate effectively on behalf of participants? And we're over time going to build up a very large database on all of this that will help us refine and improve the scheme. We've already done a number of things since the scheme started to refine and improve it. So, for example, access requests and aligning those with existing state programs is something that we've introduced since the scheme started. And we'll continue to refine and improve the scheme as it rolls out, with a view to it being as the best it can be. In fact, I believe there's an opportunity for us to create a disability support system in Australia that's the best in the world. I've just come back from 2 overseas trips, one to Sweden and the UK and the other to Canada, and there's no doubt that what we're doing here is groundbreaking. When it comes to managing the plan and managing the money that you'll receive, there are a number of ways that you can do that. You can either leave it with the agency to manage, you can give it to a provider to manage, or you can choose to manage the money yourself. or on behalf of your family member with a disability. There's a lot of flexibility in the management arrangements, and there's a lot of flexibility in terms of supporting people with disabilities to make decisions themselves wherever it's possible. So what should you do now? I think the first thing to do is to start thinking about if you're a person with a disability, to think about your everyday needs, and as family members to think about the everyday needs of the person that you're caring for. You should also start to think about what you'd like to see in the next few years. One of the reasons that we have incorporated the idea of planning is because to date, supports have been so tightly rationed that people have had no opportunity to think ahead. And the system has not really adjusted and anticipated future needs. So it's important to think ahead about what the needs might be, whether you're thinking about a transition from early childhood to school, from school to post-school, or whether you're thinking about a change in living arrangements and moving out of home. And then also think about those informal supports and how they can be aligned with the needs of the person with the disability. And if you do that, you'll be well prepared for when the NDIS comes to you. So I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm very happy to take your questions either in this forum or afterwards. I'll be staying for the barbecue, and I often find that people prefer to ask their questions afterwards rather than in a forum like this. But I just remind you what Paul mentioned at the start, that I'm a parent of 2 children with cerebral palsy, so I understand what it's like to be a parent. And I understand what it's like to see big change coming. And in that, there's as much fear as excitement. And I would just ask you that as you go forward to keep those 2 things in mind, because there's no doubt that the NDIS represents a huge possibility. It requires a change of thinking, but with that comes enormous possibility. We're already seeing in what some people are doing with their packages incredible innovation. And there'll always be people who'll take that opportunity to innovate and change first. So also, when you're thinking about the NDIS, try and link up with people who are already in the scheme and hear about what they're doing, or go onto our website and look at some of the stories, because that may well give you some ideas about what is going to be best for you or best for your son and daughter or daughter. Thank you.